Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church. Here's what we've got for you on the menu this week. We begin with battling bronchitis. Pope Francis continues to struggle with a challenge to his health that has forced him to curtail his schedule and to abdicate public pronunciation of his various addresses. We'll explain what's going on and why it's probably important not to overinterpret it. Secondly, we've got bouncing Burke. The Pope has decided to eliminate the monthly stipend and the housing allowance for American Cardinal Raymond Burke, allegedly for promoting disunity in the Church. We'll try to unpack the consequences of all of that. Third, jousting with the Germans. The Vatican continues its efforts to try to rein in the German Synodal Way. We'll explain what's going on there and what the issues are. Fourth, we've got cops and robbers. The COP28 summit is continuing to unfold in Dubai. The Pope is continuing to exert moral leadership. We'll explain why it's not yet clear if Francis is going to get the result he actually wants from this much ballyhooed climate change summit. And finally, we've got friends and enemies, how a new controversy in Italy illustrates that sometimes a pope has just as much to fear from his friends as he does his foes. All of that and more is waiting for you on this episode of Last Week in the Church, so please stick around. This is our official Last Week in the Church infomercial, because I come to you with a special offer for all of those would-be Catholic eggheads out there. That is, if you're the kind of person who likes sounding smart, who likes creating the impression that you know things other people don't, that certainly describes me. If that describes you, you're going to want to know about this. Now, I've already spoken about this new app, this new online resource called Magisterium AI. Basically, what it allows you to do is to type in a question like, what does it mean that the Pope is infallible? Or what does the Catholic Church teach about the environment? Or, whatever. And it will give you a short, smart, easily digestible answer based on more than 5,000 official magisterial texts. But recently, these guys have created a new feature on the app. It's called the Scholarly Mode, which draws not just on official texts, but also the best and brightest of Catholic thinkers and theologians over the centuries, from Augustine and Aquinas to more contemporary figures. And we'll also give you a very quick answer about what those folks have had to say about what the Church teaches on various issues. Now, I promise you that if you try this once, you're going to wonder how in God's name you ever lived without it. It's brought to you by our friends at Longbeard. They are the digital marketing and design company that provide the IT backbone for Crux. They provide the same service for a slew of other Catholic organizations and outfits. They're brilliant, and they are creative, and they are tremendous. And I'm kind of out of adjectives at this point, which is saying something because I traffic in adjectives. But I am telling you, these people are the absolute level best. So check it out. This is Magisterium AI, their new scholarly mode. You're going to dig it. Magisterium.com. That is magisterium.com. It comes with my personal guarantee. All right, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, December 5th in the year 2023. As careful and attentive viewers of this show will note, we are back in our studio location in Rome near the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major. After 2 weeks of vacation in the United States, in the mile-high city of Denver, we had a great time, but we are also equally glad to be back near the heart of the action, right near the flame, where everything is happening here in and around the Vatican. And as ever, there's a lot going on. So let's dive in. We begin with battling bronchitis. For the second week in a row this past Sunday, Pope Francis delivered his traditional noontime Angelus address, not from the window of the papal apartment overlooking St. Peter's Square, but rather from his private residence in the Santa Marta, that is the hotel-like residence on Vatican grounds where he has chosen to live for the past decade. And when I say deliver, well, actually, the Pope himself did not deliver his address. He made a few fleeting remarks at the top and then turned over the actual presentation to an aide, Italian Monsignore Paolo Luca Braida, who is an official of the Secretariat of State. He is actually the Pope's premier ghostwriter. He heads the team of people in the Secretariat of State who prepare all the Pope's public addresses. And this is the latest confirmation that the Pope continues to struggle from an ailment. This first revealed itself on November 25th, when the Vatican announced that the Pope was skipping his appointments that day in order to deal with what they described at the time as a slight case of the flu. Later, they amended that to indicate that the Pope had actually gone to Rome's Gemelli Hospital to undergo a CAT scan to rule out that he was suffering from pneumonia. While, in fact, it turned out it was not pneumonia, the Vatican did later concede that actually he is suffering from an acute case of bronchitis. This is an inflammation of the tubes in the lungs that carry air to and from the lungs. And that case of bronchitis has caused the Pope to do a variety of things. The most notable is that he was unable to attend the COP28 climate change summit in Dubai as planned. He was supposed to be there December 1st through the 3rd. Of course, as we now know, he ended up not going. And he has continued, while he has continued to maintain a fairly demanding schedule, nevertheless, in his public events at least, he has not himself delivered the often somewhat prolix and lengthy addresses that his ghostwriting team prepares for him, but instead he's either just skipped them entirely or had someone else read these messages and then confined himself to delivering some brief ad-lib, off-the-cuff remarks. Now, here's the deal. Look, bronchitis is not an uncommon thing for people to come down with, particularly during the cold winter months. And there's nothing in principle life-threatening about it. It is the kind of condition that people sometimes get, and usually they get over it and they move on. Generally speaking, a bout of bronchitis lasts about 7 to 10 days in its most acute phase. We are right now at about that 10-day mark. One would expect the Pope to, continue getting better. The Vatican insists that he is improving. If we compare this past Sunday to the Sunday before these live-streamed Angeluses he has done from the Santa Marta, a week ago we saw him with an IV hookup in his hand. This past Sunday, we didn't see that. Now we understand he is continuing to take antibiotics to try to help him get over this. But, look, let's be clear. It's not as if whatever he is dealing with right now has slowed him down in any particularly notable way other than his inability to speak at length in public. This past Thursday, for instance, one day, on Thursday, the Pope had 9 separate appointments. Now, folks, I'm going to confess to you, my wife Elise and I returned from Denver this past Wednesday. We actually flew through Reykjavik in Iceland. And I just want to say, by the way, apropos of nothing, huge shout out to Iceland Air, the airline that we took. I'd never flown this particular airline before. I was a little leery of it, to be honest. It seemed a little fly-by-night to me. But in the end, actually, it was a great experience. Anyway, we got back on Wednesday. We are recording this on Monday, okay? So we have been in Rome for that entire period of time. I haven't had 9 meetings over those 5 days, okay? The Pope had 9 meetings in one day, and he's 86 years old, all right? So my point is that let's not get overly carried away by how dramatic this particular threat to his health is. On the other hand, He is going to turn 87 later this month. He is missing part of one lung. He has been to the Gemelli Hospital 3 times so far this year. And so caution, obviously, is in order. But on the other hand, all indications are that he is mounting a slow but steady recovery. The true test, of course, will come later this month when we enter the Christmas season, which for most of us is a break, but for the Pope, that is prime time. He is on stage from the 8th of December, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, all the way through the Feast of the Epiphany on January 6th and beyond. That will give us a true gauge of where the Pope's health actually stands. In the meantime, what I would suggest is there is no indication so far that whatever is going on has dimmed the Pope's mental acuity anyway. He continues to seem perfectly alert and engaged. And so we will see. As ever, we will continue to track the Pope's condition on the Crux site. All right, speaking of mental acuity, we shift to our second story this week, which is Bouncing Burke. So on November 20th, the Pope had a meeting with officials in the Vatican in which he reportedly announced that he was going to be taking away the Vatican-subsidized apartment that belonging to American Cardinal Raymond Burke, and also revoking the monthly stipend that Burke receives as a Cardinal of Rome. Every Cardinal of Rome gets a monthly stipend. It's around $5,000, which is intended to allow them to pay for their expenses, and because a cardinal typically doesn't just live by himself, but usually there's an aide, maybe there are some people who are serving the household. He has other expenses. This stipend is intended to cover all of that. The Pope reportedly in this meeting with Vatican officials announced that he was going to be taking that away from Cardinal Burke on the grounds that he was promoting disunity in the church. Cardinal Raymond Burke, of course, is well known as a hero to what one might loosely call the conservative or traditionalist wing of the Catholic Church. In 2016, he was one of a small group of cardinals who submitted critical dubia or doubts with regard to the Pope's document Amoris Laetitia and its cautious opening to communion for divorced and civilly remarried Catholics. More recently, Burke was part of another small group of cardinals that submitted critical dubia with regard to the Pope's Synod of Bishops on synodality, particularly with regard to the issues of the ordination of female clergy, the potential ordination of female deacons, also the blessing of same-sex unions, episcopal authority, and a number of other issues. And in general, I think it would be fair to say that Cardinal Burke, over the past decade, has been perceived as an occasional theological critic of Pope Francis. And so the Pope has reportedly taken actions, therefore, to take away these particular privileges that Cardinal Burke, as any other retired cardinal in Rome, would enjoy. Now, the question is what to make of all of this. And, unfortunately, the reality is that reactions are sort of refracted through the standard political divisions in Catholicism. That is, if you are a liberal or progressive Catholic, sympathetic to Pope Francis, and therefore maybe not totally enamored of Cardinal Burke, maybe you see this as a long overdue comeuppance. On the other hand, if you are a somewhat more conservative Catholic that might have some reservations about certain elements of the Francis papacy, you might be inclined to see this as petty and punitive. Let me put it this way. Let me give you a hypothetical. Suppose you are the CEO of Coke, okay? And you've got a retired senior vice president who, as part of his compensation package, is getting a monthly stipend and company-sponsored housing. And this guy is running around telling everybody that Pepsi is actually a superior product. What are you going to do? Well, probably you're going to say, if you want to say that, fine, but you're not going to do it on the company dime, right? Now, of course, the response to that is the Catholic Church isn't supposed to be like Coke. It's not supposed to be a Fortune 500 company. It's not supposed to be a secular government. It's supposed to be a community of believers. And Pope Francis, as the man responsible for leading that community, has repeatedly said he wants dialogue and he wants to listen to all voices in the conversation. So how do you square all of these things? Well, I'm not sure you can. I think, at the end of the day, what we have is a situation in which a cardinal who is undeniably critical of this papacy on certain fronts has been told that the church is not going to subsidize that criticism. Now, is that fair? Or is that, authoritarian? Or punitive? Well, I suppose that is in the eye of the beholder. The one thing I think is fair to say is that as opposed to some other cases in which prelates have been sanctioned for one thing or another, Cardinal Burke so far himself has not said word one on this situation. Now, many people have spoken in his name. He himself has not spoken out about it, and that, I think we would have to say, is probably admirable restraint. In terms of what future role Cardinal Burke may have, I'm personally deeply skeptical that this is going to amount to a kind of gag order. I think Cardinal Burke's trajectory is that when he perceives issues of significance, he will speak out on them. And I'm not sure that the perception of having had his wings clipped by Pope Francis is necessarily going to persuade his base to stop listening. So does this change the status quo? Probably not very much, but it has given us something to talk about over the past week. All right, speaking of something to talk about, Cardinal Burke is not the only Catholic prelate who has sort of been in hot water in recent days, because over the past week, we have also seen that the bishops of Germany, particularly those most supportive of Germany's controversial Synodal Way, this is, of course, that multi-year process in Germany, consultation with not just the country's bishops, clergy, and religious, but also its laity and other stakeholders, has resulted in a number of controversial proposals. The Synodal Way, for instance, made a recommendation to revisit the ban on women clergy in the Catholic Church. It made a recommendation in favor of reevaluating church teaching on homosexuality, in particular favoring the blessing of same-sex unions. It is also pressing ahead with the idea of creating a new governing body for the Catholic Church in Germany, that we can, not just a bishops' conference, in other words, but something called a synodal council that would be composed of both bishops and laity, in which for decisions to be approved, you would have to have a 2/3 majority, which means that bishops by themselves could not make decisions, binding decisions, for the church in that country. All of this has generated great consternation in many quarters, and the Vatican, along the way, has repeatedly tried to weigh in to say, hey, wait a minute, fellas, slow down. Some of this is a little much. And over the last week, we have seen that happen again. The first development was a group of 4 female theologians in Germany who had basically quit participating in the Synodal Way over their concerns, sent a letter to Pope Francis. The Pope responded to it, saying he shared their alarm that the church in Germany seemed to be drifting away from the position of the universal church. And then this past week, what we saw is that Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Pope's Secretary of State, sent a letter to the Secretary General of the German Bishops' Conference, who, by the way, is a lay woman, basically saying that scheduled meetings between leaders of the German Church and the Vatican in January, April, and June 2024 were not going to be discussing any changes to church teaching on homosexuality, and they were not going to be discussing women clergy because those are basically no-fly zone. Okay, he said, we're not going to talk about that because that's already off the table. Certain leaders of the German Church have objected to all of that, saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not necessarily what we think the Pope wants. We're not sure if this is the Vatican or the Pope. Anyway, we think there's some wiggle room here, and we want to keep talking. Another development that came to light during this past week is a kind of split between Bishop Georg Baitzing, who is the head of the German Bishops' Conference, and Archbishop Stanislaw Gadecki in Poland, who is the head of the Polish Bishops' Conference, which, well known, tends to be a little bit more conservative than the German. Archbishop Gadecki apparently wrote to the Pope earlier this year to express some concerns about the German Synodal Way. His letter was published in late November by a German news outlet. This prompted a response from Bishop Baitzing in Germany, basically accusing him of being unbrotherly and of overstepping his authority by criticizing the actions of another bishops' conference. And so, we have a rift not simply between Germany and the Vatican, but also now between Germany and Poland. All of this, of course, illustrates that the path being blazed, or the trail being blazed, by the Catholic Church in Germany is not one that the entire universal church necessarily wants to share. Now, here's the thing. The difference between the situation in Germany, right, and, say, the situation in the United States, where we've recently seen Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, deposed, defenestrated, if you like, from his diocese, and now Cardinal Burke being punished, in a sense, by having some of his privileges revoked, is that in Germany, these bishops who are leading the press, or at least going along for the ride on this press for various purported reforms, none of them have yet suffered any sanctions, any disciplinary consequences for doing so. Going forward, I suppose that's the real question. If Pope Francis and the Vatican are truly serious about telling the German church that no means no, they may face the challenge of coming up with a convincing way of doing that gets the point across, because at least so far, I think the takeaway would be that the Germans feel that whatever these letters from Vatican officials may say, they don't feel particularly inhibited about continuing to move forward with their agenda. We will see how all of this plays out. All right, fourth up this week, we've got cops and robbers. So the COP28 summit on climate change, the UN-sponsored summit on climate change, continues to unfold in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. And despite the fact that Pope Francis has been unable to be there in person, nevertheless, he is continuing to make every effort to try to influence its deliberations. He has to date dispatched two separate messages to the COP summit. One was a message to the General Assembly at COP, read aloud on his behalf by Cardinal Burke. Another was a message to the Faith Pavilion that was opened as part of this COP28 gathering on behalf of the various religious traditions of humanity. Once again, the Pope's message was delivered by Cardinal Burke. In his message to the General Assembly, he indicated that the degradation of the environment is not just a matter of individual, but also of structural sin. In his message to the Faith Pavilion, he said that climate change is not simply a political, but a religious problem. He has called for dramatic action that would basically limit greenhouse gas emissions, limit a rise in global temperatures, and he has insisted that accomplishing these aims can't simply be a matter of brokering political deals. It also has to involve lifestyle changes, particularly in developed, that is, wealthy nations, to try to adjust our patterns of consumption in order to protect the natural environment, to protect creation. Now, is the Pope going to get what he wants out of this summit? Well, I think the jury on that is still out. Remember, the COP28 summit goes on until the 12th of December, so we haven't written the final word about it yet. So far, the signals are a bit mixed. It was widely hailed, for instance, that at the beginning of the summit, the participating nations agreed on what's called a loss and damage fund, that is, a way of compensating poor nations that are bearing the brunt of the cost for storms and droughts and other dramatic climatic events associated with climate change. That was considered a breakthrough. On the other hand, those nations also agreed to a threefold increase in commitments to renewable energy, but neither India nor China signed on to that agreement. And India, in fact, has basically said, look, we don't care what you say. We're going to continue to rely on coal because it's a cornerstone of our development plan. And so, at the end of the day, we don't yet know what this summit is going to produce. What we can say is that Pope Francis is, short of his physical presence, trying to pull out all the stops he possibly can to make it clear how important this summit is to him and how important the broader cause of environmental protection is. Now, what all that is going to mean, we don't know. I think it is fair to say, however, that if this COP28 summit ends with an agreement for what is perceived as dramatic action in favor of combating climate change, that Pope Francis is going to get a significant share of the credit. On the other hand, if it's perceived as a flop, then this may become part of what critics would say is a growing list of diplomatic disappointments for Pope Francis, which would include, so far, the inability of the Vatican to move the ball on the conflict in Ukraine, even the humanitarian aim of returning some of those Ukrainian children who were seized by Russian forces, and also the inability of the Vatican to move the needle in a particularly significant way on the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. In other words, what is at stake here is perceptions of the Pope's diplomatic and political effectiveness. We will see. All right, finally this week, and briefly, friends and enemies, how a new controversy in Italy demonstrates that sometimes Pope's heartache doesn't just come from people who were against him, but people who were for him. So, there is a figure in Italy, a guy by the name of Luca Casarini. He is a veteran left-wing activist. He helped lead protests against the G8 summit in Geneva a few years ago. He's a leader of the No Global movement. And since 2018, he has been the head of a nonprofit group called Mediterranea Saving Humans, which operates the only civilly registered ship in Italy that is involved in saving migrants and refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. Pope Francis obviously likes the guy. He has met with his NGO on multiple occasions, and he named Casarini a special delegate to his recent Synod of Bishops on Synodality. Now, what has emerged is that Casarini, along with 5 other individuals, is under investigation in Sicily for allegedly receiving payoffs to bring migrants and refugees into Italy in ways that violate Italian immigration law. And as part of that investigation, electronic messages, basically WhatsApp messages, among Casarini and several of his colleagues in this NGO have been captured by prosecutors, and leaks of those intercepts have begun appearing in the Italian press. And what they appear to suggest, and again, we should say, Casarini himself has said that some of the quotes that have been attributed to him out of these alleged intercepts are false. Others, he say, have been taken out of context, so he is denying some of this. But what they purport to show, anyway, is that Casarini and his colleagues basically see the Catholic Church as a kind of big ATM machine. They're discussing how they can put pressure on the Pope and some of his key allies among prelates, including Italian Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, to basically pony up more money for Mediterranea. And the suggestion is that Casarini and his guys aren't in this just for the noble cause of saving the lives of marginalized and vulnerable migrants and refugees. They're also in it for a payday, and that has raised questions about the judgment of Pope Francis in terms of the kinds of people with whom he surrounds himself. Now, we're going to have to see how all this plays out. Casarini has said, look, we're not embarrassed by taking money from the church. We love the fact that the church practices what it preaches about loving its neighbor, and our finances are completely transparent and so on. A judge is supposed to rule as to whether Casarini is going to be bound over for trial on December 6th. If that happens, clearly there will be a harder look at the financial dimension of all of this. We will continue to follow this story in the Crux site. But again, it illustrates that sometimes when you're a pope, it's not just the Stricklands and Burkes of the world you have to worry about, but also the people who wrap themselves in the papal flag, but perhaps not always in ways that make you completely comfortable. All right, that is our show for this week. Obviously, we will have full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. We will be with you next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed week. Stay safe, stay healthy. We will talk to you again very soon.